The concept of vampires has become a popular trend in modern times, where the idea of an individual hungering for blood almost comes across as cliché. We've seen several variations of vampires from TV, books, and movies, and have come to understand almost every trope of the vampire kind, to the point where if we were to find ourselves encountered by a real-life vampire, we'd just know to grab some garlic or a holy cross to use in our defense. However, vampires and their status were not so clearly defined hundreds of years ago, and to the common man, such a creature would likely have been considered demonic and absolutely terrifying. Traditional beliefs about vampires that were shared throughout Europe seem to be mostly centered around the idea that the deceased, once buried, could rise from their graves and harm those still alive. Where this notion comes from is not known, but it does link as far back as Mesopotamian legends that if a corpse was not buried properly, it could return to assault the living. In some cases, which we'll talk about later on in this video, suspected vampires were dug up from their graves, and those in attendance would gawk in horror. We now understand that these superstitions may have been born out of a lack of understanding for how bodies decompose. It's said that at the time, the corpse of the suspected vampire's teeth and fingernails appeared to have grown longer, which may have given way to the idea of vampires having fangs and sometimes claws. These corpses were often seen with blood around the mouth, but we now know that when internal organs of a corpse breaks down, dark bloody fluid can leak out from the nose and the mouth, perhaps giving the illusion that they had been consuming blood from someone else. As a result of blood consumptions, vampires were usually reported as being bloated and maintaining a purplish or dark skin colour, evidently different to the pale skin vampires that are commonly portrayed today. Other cases identify vampires as being blamed for the causing or spreading of diseases in times where contamination and infection were less understood. It's not hard to imagine that for a lack of scientific explanation, blaming an unseen force that attacked the community at night became as sound logic as any. It would appear that the idea behind vampires causing disease gave people an image for which to personify a disease and make it more tangible, and so by killing vampires, it supplied them with the illusion that they were actually doing something to tackle the disease, as opposed to the sad reality of just hoping their immune systems would be strong enough to repel it. And so due to this, outbreaks of plague usually went hand in hand with outbreak of vampire cases. In fact, there exist cases in where unearthed skulls around Europe in the 16th and 17th centuries that have objects stuffed in their mouths, such as bricks, soil, stones, and various other items. Supposedly, the idea was that if a corpse had something lodged in its mouth when it reanimated as a vampire, it could not physically feed on anyone. It wouldn't be until the end of the mid-18th century did Pope Benedict declare that vampires were fictitious, a superstition, nothing more than a grim horror story of a time where we as a people simply did not know any better. And yet, anti-vampire measures were still being taken almost 100 years later in New England, where a whole vampire panic was enabled by the spreading of tuberculosis. In some cases in New England, as well as in Eastern Europe, the idea of cutting out the heart of the supposed vampire, burning it to ashes, and then feeding these ashes to those who were sick was considered a remedy. But as you can imagine, those who were fed the ashes of a human heart usually fell even more ill, or likely died because of their disease anyway. Throughout the many years of vampire activity, we've come to understand through urban myth and legend that vampires must drink blood in order to survive, and that conventionally, they do this through the biting of one's neck. Other superstitions suggest that he who is killed by a vampire becomes a vampire themselves, thus how the chain of vampires is kept from dying out. Of course, there's also the idea that vampires are immortal, or have a ridiculously long lifespan compared to the average human. In more modern times, there exists an idea of energy vampires, who consume the life force of people by simply existing within their life, draining them of their energy with little more than their personality. You can usually find them in the everyday working environment, the post office, and the dating app Tinder. Vampires are also said to be master shapeshifters, in that they can change into animals, usually bats, and maintain the ability to fly. Others suggest that some vampires, depending on experience, are masters of hypnosis, and that they can manipulate anyone into doing virtually anything they want. It could also be said that this is the basis for the idea that vampires are sexual creatures, or at least sexual predators, and that they are able to influence their victims to perform to their dark desires. Others suggest that vampires are masters of seduction, and that they use their charms to lure their victims to their homes, where they pounce on them with their fangs. But vampires, for all their strengths, also have a number of weaknesses that make them pretty crap hunters if you ask me. For one, they can't go outside in the daylight, as the sunlight would literally incinerate them. They are also said not to be able to gain entry into your property without your invitation, and while this is a lesser known trope, I imagine they use their charms and hypnosis in order to receive consent to step into your household. Furthermore, it's understood that vampires are not able to walk on consecrated grounds, meaning they'd be physically incapable of entering a church, or would burn upon contact. So just by that, we've learned that so long as you stay inside at night and keep away from the doors and windows, you've literally defeated every vampire who's ever existed. But if you were out at night and were stumbled upon by a vampire, you'd still have a number of ways to defend against them. True, they are said to have supernatural strength, but in some cases, all that needs to be done is to hold up the Holy Cross of Christ, and a vampire would shy away. Holy water, garlic, and the element of silver are also said to be great weapons against vampires, who have no real defense against such an arsenal. Other more natural forms of defense include wild roses, the plant hawthorn, and even mustard seeds. Another lesser known way to defeat a vampire is to put running water between you and them, like a stream. Amusingly, there exists a Chinese myth that by spilling rice in front of a vampire, the vampire becomes bound to his spot and cannot move until he has counted every grain of rice that is spilled. Other beliefs include using mirrors against vampires, perhaps to expose them, given that vampires are said not to cast a reflection. Of course, failing all of that, you could always drive a stake through a vampire's heart, which we've seen done several times in modern film, and that usually puts an end to a vampire's life. In Slavic culture, staking was the most commonly cited method for dealing with vampires, while in Russia, ash wood would specifically be needed to be used when impaling a vampire. Aspen was also used for stakes, as it was believed that Jesus Christ's cross was made from aspen, and so could loosely be considered holy and therefore effective. Interestingly, impaling through the vampire's heart was not a universal belief, as areas in Russia and Germany would impale the mouth, while areas in Serbia aimed for the stomach. In other areas of Germany though, decapitation was the only means to dealing with vampires, where the head was even buried away from the body so as to hasten the departure of the soul. In Romania, meanwhile, the corpse would be pinned to the ground with spikes so as to prevent it from rising again. Iron needles were pierced into the heart, mouth, eyes, ears, and between the fingers, just to be sure to cause as much suffering to the being upon its potential reawakening. It wouldn't be uncommon to see boiling water poured into graves either, so as to incinerate the vampire, as well as any chance of it ever rising from the grave again. In far less gruesome and perhaps less creative prevention schemes, a bullet would be shot through the casket, as if to kill the person again. In various folklore from around the world, the creation of vampires differ quite drastically. For example, in both Slavic and Chinese traditions, corpses that were leapt over by an animal were said to become one of the undead. Furthermore, a wound that had not been treated with boiling water was also said to be more susceptible to becoming a vampire, though the reasoning is unknown. Meanwhile, in Russian folklore, vampires were actually once witches or occultists who had turned against the Orthodox Church when they were alive, and that in death, they were cursed to wander in the darkness as vampires. Other practices, including burying a corpse upside down or burying a corpse with weapons to ward off demons, were commonly spread in Europe and possibly stem from the ancient Greek tradition of placing coins in the mouth. This would see that the dead were able to pay a toll to cross into the Greek underworld, on the river Styx. Others, however, suggest that the placing of coins in the mouth are merely wards against spirits from entering the body, or again, as a precaution to prevent a vampire from being able to bite down. In other European lands, legs were sawn off so as to prevent the vampire from being able to move about freely. Others would spill sand around the gravesite so as to stall the vampire until daylight, for they would be forced to count every grain, similar to the spilling of rice, as I mentioned earlier. But if you thought burial traditions when it came to vampires was weird, identifying vampires was even weirder. There exist traditions of sending in young virgin boys upon the backs of a virgin horse into a cemetery. The horse would make a few laps around the cemetery, and when it came to a vampire's grave, it would buck and lose its composure. In the addition of having dark or purplish skin, vampires were said to have a healthy appearance, considering they should have been decomposing. Blood around the mouth and nose were another sign that the person in question was a vampire, though it appears that this could have been bodily discharge, as I mentioned earlier. Other signs of a vampire were indicated by the death of cattle, sheep, and neighbours, though such a mass spread of disease in this time period is now likely chalked up to disease. Folklore stories detail vampires identifying themselves to the public by haunting their victims in their homes, throwing stones at their windows, and pressing upon them in their sleep. As we can see through these extreme measures, vampire threats were taken very seriously, but I think it's fair to say that in hindsight, that vampires may very well have been an exaggeration of a people who, as I mentioned earlier, were simply trying to personify a disease, allowing them to get a better grip on what they were dealing with. Such exaggerations happened much later on too, with the infamous dictator himself, the so-called original Dracula, known as Vlad the Impaler, where many associate him with being a vampire, despite never actually demonstrating any signs of vampiric behaviour. In fact, it appears much of Vlad's story was dramatised by the 1897 novel by Bram Stoker, titled Dracula, in which many of Vlad's gory exploits during his rule served as inspiration for the character Dracula. Where Stoker likely got the idea for Dracula was likely inspired by Vlad's father, Vlad Dracul. Vlad Dracul's son, who was Vlad the Impaler, would become known as the son of Dracul, or put more simply, Dracula. So perhaps disappointingly to some, the link between Vlad and Dracula is merely because of his namesake, and not because he was some fearsome hunter in the night, preying on victims by sinking his teeth into their throats. Indeed, Vlad the Impaler was certainly a butcherer of his enemies, but it appears his vampire qualities are purely conjured up by Bram Stoker's novel. Saying that though, many German papers would print images of Vlad eating dinner amongst a sea of impaled bodies, and would spin stories about Vlad drinking the blood of his enemies, sometimes in an eloquent fashion, by using a chalice. It's rumours like these that may have helped inspire Stoker to create the legendary Dracula that we all know today. But are there any cases in history that lead us to believe that vampires were indeed a very real threat, and that they were more than just the manifestations of the imagination? Or there exist a few cases that might just have you second guessing as to whether or not vampires are just a fictitious entity. In the early 18th century, a peasant named Peter Bergerovitch would be blamed for committing 9 murders, all of which transpired while he himself was dead. In an unassuming village of Kiselova, in the once Austrian-occupied Serbia, Peter Bergerovitch died at the age of 62, sometime in 1728. However, just a few days later, he returned to his family in the thick of night, banging on the door and demanding for food. The family were too stunned to comprehend what was happening, most notably Peter's son, who did not have the nerve to simply oblige his father's request. And so Peter brutally murdered him there and then, sucking the blood out of his neck. Peter fled back into the night, and his wife did not see him again. However, others certainly would. Over the next 8 days, other villagers began to become sick with exhaustion, with doctors diagnosing the ill patients with suffering from blood loss. Each of the victims claimed that they'd seen Peter Blagojevich in the middle of the night, before they eventually died from exhaustion and blood loss. Given that all of these victims identified Peter, and his own wife had even testified that it was him who'd killed their son that night, the villagers agreed to exhume Peter's body and investigate his corpse. Peter's body had not decomposed at all, despite having been buried for several weeks now. His skin complexion was as bright as ever, his hair and nails had grown, and he looked relatively fresh for a man that should have been worm food. Some accounts have it that he was breathing as if he was asleep, but that his eyes were wide open. Blood was caked around his mouth, some suggesting that this was the blood of his victims. The villagers all agreed to drive a stake through his heart so as to prevent him from rising again. Supposedly, as this was done, blood exploded out from his ears and his mouth. His eyes flashed with recognition of those around him before closing again, this time for good. His body was burned, and a mixture of garlic and other repellents was scattered around the cemetery as a deterrent to other vampires. As can be imagined, vampire cases in the early 18th century certainly left a trail of death in their wake, although many of these cases of vampires occur after the suspect had already died. Another case in this category takes place in Gdańsk in Bohemia in the year 1706. A herdsman named Mislata of Blow was said to haunt the town of Gdańsk long after his death. In fact, he wasn't just an elusive hunter in the night, but more like a brazen predator who'd go about identifying the people he recognized, calling their names as he snuck up on them. Those he approached were said to die days later, and such supposed events would trigger the authorities into digging up his body and driving a stake into his heart. But while that may have usually worked, the Blow vampire proved to be stubborn, and was said to show up several days later once more, even killing some of his victims in cold blood. At this point, I would have just burned his body and been done with, but the people of Gdańsk were a bit more sadistic, in that they pierced his body with several stakes first, and then burned him afterwards. A chilling account suggests that as the body was burned, the Blow vampire could be heard screaming within the flames. Perhaps one of the most compelling accounts of vampirism stems from the Kingdom of Hungary in the late 16th century. Elizabeth Bathory, better known as the Blood Countess, was a noblewoman who married into a prestigious family. Her husband, though, would later be elevated to the chief and commander of the Hungarian army against the Ottomans, and would therefore spend a lot of his time away from her. In her loneliness, Bathory was said to spend time with her aunt, who taught her how to do witchcraft. She also grew bored in her husband's absence, and began to take several lovers. She also began inflicting grievous bodily harm on her servants, going on to torture them using barbed lashes, cudgels, and iron tongs. There is also the case of what is called an iron virgin, in which encapsulated the victims like a coffin. The insides were layered with spikes, and with a victim inside, they would be pierced. The obsession with blood would begin when Bathory noticed that after beating one of her servants, their blood would land on her skin and began to tighten it, making it look younger. With this in mind, she used the Iron Virgin to drain the blood of her victims, and then proceeded to bathe in it, believing that by coating herself in their blood, she could retain her youth. Supposedly, she had gone through so many commoner girls in society that she would begin preying on women of a higher status, luring them back to her home and then killing them. Eventually though, Bathory was discovered, and she and her allies were placed on trial for a total of 80 counts of murder, though in her diary she notes she had killed a total of 650 women and girls. However, because of her royal status, she was not executed, and instead locked away in her castle, forbidden from speaking to anyone, in a room that had no windows and no doors. A small opening was said to have been carved in the wall so that food could be brought to her, and it is here that Elizabeth Bathory would die 3 years later. There exists a legend that shortly after her death, a nearby village was plagued with a few murders, and that some young women were found dead, their bodies horribly mutilated and drained of their blood. Had they met with some untimely end at the hands of some animal or an unassociated psychopath? Or had Elizabeth Bathory risen from her grave as a living vampire? On that note, I'll leave you to ponder on the mysteries of vampires and whether you believe if vampires are real or not. Do you think that such a creature could have existed, or are we allowing our imaginations to run wild? Do you know of any other compelling vampire stories from history? Let me know them in the comments below, and perhaps I can do a video of them in the future. Until then, if you've enjoyed today's video, then don't forget to give it a thumbs up and hit the subscribe button. Until the next time, guys.